everybody. I'm Johnnie Jae, and I'm from the Otoe and Choctaw tribes out of Oklahoma, although I'm currently living in Los Angeles. And thank you all for showing up for surviving the zombie apocalypse, Rez Style. So Native people have a long history of surviving in harsh environments. We've also had to deal with our fair share of threats, both natural and man-made. But the important thing to know about Native folks is that we are already living post-apocalyptic lives. In the event of a zombie apocalypse, Native people are uniquely positioned to survive because we've already faced and survived an apocalypse. And and that apocalypse is a colonization, which is still an ongoing process. So in 1942, I have a little thing here. The dead rose from the sea. The new worlds were paradise, but was soon turned to hell by the zombies unleashed by Christopher Columbus and his crew as they moved across the lands, devouring and destroying everything in their path. But still, we survive and thrive. So, while we didn't know what to expect when colonization began, we thought, hey, here's these new people, and while we did have our reservations, we did try to help. We tried to welcome people onto the new lands. We helped them to survive. We helped them learn how to navigate the lands, how to cultivate food, and how to recognize food in this new lands. And there are a lot of things to consider when we're looking at how to survive a zombie apocalypse, especially in terms of how we survive colonization as Native people. And the 4 areas that I focus on are strongholds, communication, food and medicine, and defense and weaponry. The most important steps to take when the poo hits the fan, so to speak, is finding an escape plan from the more populated and unfortified areas that leave you exposed. For us urban natives, getting out of the city and more populated areas would be a major priority. But for the most part, a lot of our Native communities are already in prime locations due to their rurality and the distance to traditional strongholds used by our ancestors. Some of the strongholds that we had were for the Comanche people, Palo Duro Canyon. For the Navajo people, it was the Grand Canyon. They also had Canyon de Chelly. And for the Lakota, it was Unakizan. And for us Choctaw people, we had a stronghold called Mabia, which I really love speaking about. It's one of my favorite points of history to learn and to talk about, and we'll get into that in just a second. So when we think of strongholds, how many of you know what a stronghold is? Great. So for us, strongholds are places where you go, where you can feel protected, where you have the advantage. Like you know the lay of the land, you know how to use that land and how to use the resources that are in that area. And in times of trouble for Native people, we always went to those places. Unakizan, for example, is a Lakota stronghold, and right before the Wounded Knee massacre, there was another massacre that occurred, and it occurred at Unakizan. And to this day, there is a traditional warrior society that stands guard to make sure that the bodies of those who were massacred remain undisturbed, because it is a place where a lot of geologists and archaeologists, they want to go in and study this because it is a part of our history. And so they are up there still 24/7, making sure that nobody is accessing this land without permission. But what happened was, before Wounded Knee happened, there was already word that, there was danger, and they were putting villages on alert. And one of the villages was near Red Table. And what happened was, all the men and warriors had already gone out to kind of assist with Wounded Knee. They were already heading that direction because they knew that there was trouble going on. And all that was left of the village was women, children, and elders. And somebody came and gave them a warning. So as soon as they got the warning, they started making their way up to Unakizan. And they left a little too late because the cavalry was already on their trail. And so they were able to follow them to this stronghold. And it was going up to a cliffy area. And they got followed up, and unfortunately, they weren't able to escape that because it was up on a cliff. And what ended up happening when they started the massacre was a lot of the people that were killed were pushed off the cliff. And so their bodies remain at the bottom of the cliff. And today there's a traditional warrior society, that still stands guard to make sure that they're not disturbed. So also when we think of strongholds, I think one of the best examples is from the movie Thunderheart. How many of you guys have seen Thunderheart? Really? Okay. Well, Thunderheart is, it's not technically a Native movie, but I think every Native has watched this, and Val Kilmer is awesome in this. But I think this is a good example to kind of get an idea of how traditional strongholds for Native people work. So I'm going to play you this little clip. So since you haven't seen the film, what happened here is they discovered that the water is being contaminated, and the plot has kind of unfolded, and they're kind of trying to expose them, but they kind of get blocked in here. And all throughout this movie, people kept telling him to run for the stronghold, and he didn't understand what they were saying when they were telling him this until this scene. As you can see, as they're kind of panning out, you can see all the ladders that are there behind the canyons that they use to access those. When you're looking at traditional strongholds, this is exactly what they were looking for, places that were hard to access, but they knew how to access that land. They knew how to access those spaces. And when you're looking at strongholds, especially in a zombie apocalypse, we need places that are going to be safe. And for the most part, when we're looking at surviving zombie apocalypses in pop culture, they tend to go to places like in the Dawn of the Dead, the mall, where there's food. Even when I'm thinking of how would I survive in an urban area, I'm always thinking, a Lowe's or a Home Depot, a Costco, where there's a lot of snacks to get me through. But for Native people, it would be returning to these traditional strongholds. And a lot of our communities are already those strongholds because of how rural they are, which brings me to my favorite thing to talk about ever, which is Mabia. So Mabia was a small Native village that was fortified for war in what is now central Alabama. It was a site of a major battle between the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto and the Native American chief Tuscaloosa in 1540. The battle was considered one of the the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil, with the death toll being between 5,000 and 11,000. So Mabia, when I say it was a village fortified for war, it was basically a Trojan horse. During the day and during times where there was no threat, it was just a typical trading village. And it was comprised of several different tribes, not just Choctaw, but also Seminole, it was the Cherokee, it was the Chickasaw. It was a large village. And whenever there was a threat, this village could hold up to 2,500 warriors within its walls. And all of the buildings that you would see had little hiding spaces, little nooks for warriors to be in. So what ended up happening was Tuscaloosa was taken captive, and they were traveling back to Mexico. And Hernando de Soto, they needed supplies. And so Tuscaloosa, because he knew this was coming, had already sent word to Mabia to be ready, and he was bringing them there. And so while they were on the way to Mabia, the village was already getting ready for war. And so all the women and children were sent out of the village, and they were sent in to seek refuge in neighboring villages. And all the warriors were taking up arms in the village and just getting ready. So Tuscaloosa and Hernando de Soto showed up, and everything seemed to be going well. They started kind of brokering and negotiating a release of Tuscaloosa. But somewhere else in the village, a fight broke out between one of the Spaniards and one of the native warriors, and it kind of set off a chain reaction. And it just turned into an all-out battle. And the battle went on for so long without a break for either side, to the point where they were literally having to drink blood-soaked water because that was all that was there. And after about maybe a day of battle, the natives were able to drive out the Spaniards. But because the village was surrounded by palisades and it only had one exit in and one exit out, the Spanish came around and they blocked that exit, and they set the palisades on fire. So in the end, the natives there were finally defeated, but this had been a place of several different battles that had been more successful. But it's kind of an example of how native warfare was not as simplistic as we tend to think of it, or how it's portrayed in a lot of movies. But in a lot of movies, you kind of see people, natives, just riding out on horses. There's not a lot of thought into strategy. They make it seem like it was just kind of like a free-for-all. But a lot of natives were very strategic in the way they thought about warfare. You know, it was not just going out into riding into battle and what happened happened. You know, it was a lot of compromising with other tribes, building different alliances with different communities, and coming together to try and find out where the best place would be to enact in war or in battle. And this is one of my favorite things to talk about, because Mabia was lost. And right now, you know, they find hints and pieces of where it could possibly be, but it's a part of history that we're still learning and reclaiming and learning more about. And for me as a Choctaw, you know, this is a really special part of my history to learn about, because you don't typically read a lot of history about Choctaw warfare. And when you do delve into it, a lot of it is not from a Choctaw perspective, but from a non-native perspective, which means that you're kind of getting a skewed perspective of what actually was going on. So, in the event of an apocalyptic disasters, it's not just staying safe that's going to matter. We're going to have to learn how to communicate with each other. And right now, I know we're all addicted to our cell phones. If we need to get information or get information out, the first thing we do is pick up our phones. You know, we're going to Twitter, we're going to Facebook, you know, now we're going to Blue Sky or Threads, or, you know, all of these new social medias that are kind of popping up and driving me nuts at the moment. It's like every week there's a new one. They're like, you got to sign up for this one. This is where we're going now. So communication is going to be very key. And for a lot of Native communities, we're going to fare a lot better when it comes to communication, because we are still very rural, and whereas a lot of radio stations have gone digital, we haven't. And the main source of news that Native people get is through traditional radio. And so when communications go down, it's not going to be much different for Natives. And in fact, you know, I don't know if Native communities are actually going to know anything has gone on right away, which is funny, because I don't know if any of you guys had, there's a book called Moon of the Crusted Snow, or Snow of the Crusted Moon. I know I'm mixing that up, but it's a really good book. And that scenario plays out where the Native community, you know, the poo hits the fan for the rest of the world, but the Native community didn't actually realize anything had happened until survivors started trickling in needing assistance. And that's going to be very much the case for a lot of our Native communities. And how many of you guys have seen Blood Quantum? Okay, cool. So Blood Quantum kind of illustrates this a little bit too, about how communication and how building a community is going to be very key in surviving a zombie apocalypse. For Native, it's not going to be just like radio. It's not going to just be just like handheld radios. But we'll have to go back to more traditional means of communication. For a lot of Native communities, especially out in the plains, and I'm sure here along the western coast, it's going to be smoke signals. Because especially out here on the West Coast, you know, certain woods burn different colors. So certain colors of smoke could symbolize different things for different communities. For the plains, you know, they were able to kind of, I guess you would say, manipulate the smoke, you know, like where it would come up into like 3 puffs or maybe 2 puffs, which is kind of funny because I talk about the usefulness of smoke signals, but if I see it in a pop culture film, like Wonder Woman, for example, you know, it's like, really smoke signals? Because there was a part where Chief in Wonder Woman, you know, he was telling Wonder Woman, when it's safe, I'll send up a signal. And so, you know, you're waiting for that signal, and all of a sudden you see the 3 little smoke signals pop up. And I was just like, really? Like, you were doing so well until that point with Native representation. But, you know, smoke signals will be very useful in the event of a zombie apocalypse, which the irony is not lost on me in that. The other thing is runners. So in the last, I'd say maybe 10 years, we've seen a resurgence of running societies in Native communities. We've seen a lot of Natives, take up long distance running for marathons, participating in, some of the larger, like the Boston Marathon. I've had a friend who went overseas to participate in a 2,500 mile marathon. It was like a whole huge thing for them to be involved, but we've seen a resurgence of this, and I think a lot of that has to go back to being prepared, because, it's not just a zombie apocalypse that we're facing. We also have a climate apocalypse that could be a potential threat. We have all these different things. As we know, we got hit with the pandemic, which is, of course, another threat that threw our communities for a loop. So we've seen a resurgence of like runner societies. And that's a large part of that too, is because that was the way a lot of our communities communicated. Runners would run from village to village, and sometimes those villages weren't close. They could be 20 to 30 miles away, but the runners had to be able to run that very quickly in order to send warnings and messages to other tribes. And so we would see a return to kind of like having these messengers in our communities. Sign language. Right now we have a lot of disabled people that are learning, sign language. Even me as a non-deaf person, I know a little bit of sign language because I have friends who are deaf, and deafness in Native communities is really high. And so sign language is a really good resource to learn, but it's not just American Sign Language. Even before colonization happened, we had Native American Sign Language. How many of you guys have seen Rez Dogs? Okay, in the first episode of Rez Dogs, you could kind of see them communicating with hand signals, and they're using Native American Sign Language because that's still something that Natives do. We communicate not just with our words, but with body language, whether it's through Native American Sign Language or even just pointing our lips. So if you see someone making kissing faces at you, they're not trying to kiss you, they're trying to give you directions. Just remember that. The other thing is talking drums. So drums in Native American societies, you more typically see with like at powwows, but we also use them for communication. The way certain drums the tones would mean a different warning or a different meaning, like it could be a call to supper, or it could be a call to a meeting, or it could mean that, hey, there's a threat on the way, we need to get ready. So talking drums would be another way, it means a communication that we would have to look to. And then, of course, radio, which I already talked about, is something that is going to be very huge. A lot of our Native communities are still very connected. Even our more rural communities up in Alaska have access to radio, and it's not digitized. And a lot of Native communities don't even have access to Wi-Fi. So, communication would still be kind of old school for us, and it wouldn't be a huge culture shock to suddenly be without our cell phones, because even when I go home to visit family in Taos, which isn't a tourist area, I always tell people, you're not going to get a hold of me because I do not get signal up here. And that's always a culture shock for me, to suddenly not have access to Instagram where I could post my dinner for the day, especially when I'm in New Mexico, because the food is so tasty there, you want to share it. Which brings me to which brings me to traditional foods and medicine. So traditional foods and medicines are going to be very important in the event of an apocalypse, mainly because we're not going to necessarily have the easy access that we have now to pharmacies or to doctors, so we're going to have to rely on more ancestral knowledge. And these have been an important part of Native cultures for millennium, and in a world where we are constantly under threat, we're starting to see more of our communities return to traditional means of medicine and food. Like, we have a huge resurgence of cultural food sovereignty going on right now, which is an amazing thing to see, as a lot of our Native chefs are getting more and more recognition for the work that they are doing. So some of the traditional foods, kind of giving you an idea, and learning about traditional food and sources will be very key, because it's not like we'll be able to head over to an IHS center or to find a pharmacy, but it also puts us at a huge disadvantage as Natives who are already on various medications for different illnesses, such as diabetes and autoimmune disease. So we need to know how we can adapt to prevent a loss of life. And these are just some of the foods that will be very vital. Wild rice is a type of grass that grows in freshwater lakes and rivers, and it's a good source of protein, fiber, and other nutrients. And this is going to be a food source that is going to be very important. And right now we see a lot of Native communities working really hard to protect the sovereignty of their wild rice, which if you're in Minnesota, wild rice is now protected as it was granted personhood. So, which is really good because a lot of Minnesota communities are trying to protect their wild rice from pipelines. And so having that personhood protection makes it a little bit easier for them to protect the wild rice beds. So how many of you guys have seen cattail? Did you ever think of it and just look at it and think you want to eat it? See, no, not me. I used to look at them and slap people with them, but you know, we used them as lightsabers when I was a kid. But cattail is very useful because it is edible, and it is actually really delicious when prepared right. But it can also be used as an antiseptic for wounds and burns, and also the dried stalks can be used to create arrow shafts, hand drills, and the leaves can be woven to create bowls, shelter, and hammocks. And you know, it's really very versatile, but when you first look at cattail, you know, you don't really think of it as being useful. You're just kind of thinking it's something there to play with, really. But let me tell you, the first time I tried cattail, I was like a little kid trying a new food. Like I was like, I'm not gonna eat it, I'm not gonna eat it. And as most things have, when I try new, they had to hold my nose until I opened my mouth and they stuck it in. And that was how I tried cattail for the first time, but it was actually really good. And when I was starting to learn about, you know, all these traditional foods that would come in handy in a zombie apocalypse, you know, cattail was really interesting because of the various uses for it, not just as food, but, you know, to be able to create shelter from. Milk thistle is another one that is going to be very important because it's used to treat many different ailments associated with the liver and gallbladder. But recent studies have shown that it can also reduce blood glucose in diabetics, which is very key because we have a lot of Native people who are diabetic, and in a case of an apocalypse, we're not going to have access to insulin, so we're going to have to find other means. And after Standing Rock, we do have a lot of traditional medicine people who are looking at ways to use different ancestral medicines to kind of combat some of the more modern illnesses that we have that our ancestors didn't have to deal with. And it's kind of a learn and, you know, kind of like a trial and error process, because even for me, I have lupus, which is an autoimmune disease. And elderberry, you know, within the pandemic, you know, a lot of our communities were really pushing elderberry to kind of help boost your immune system. Well, it turns out elderberry for people who have autoimmune disorders is actually a bad thing because it does cause your autoimmune system to kind of go into overdrive, which causes a lot of flare-ups, which is something that, you know, is very interesting to learn about. And especially if you have an autoimmune condition, you know, you need to be mindful of how these different traditional medicines are going to affect you, because while they might affect somebody else in a very positive way, it can have a negative impact on you just because of the way that your body functions. Yarrow is the bane of my existence because of my allergies and it's everywhere, but it actually is very useful in treating common colds and dysentery and also toothaches and even diarrhea. And greenbrier, this goes back to helping people with autoimmune disorders because it is used to treat gout, joint pain, urinary tract infections, and skin diseases. And this is basically just like the tip of the iceberg in learning how we can utilize our traditional food sources to kind of help us transition from more modern medicine to more ancestral knowledge and traditional medicines in the aftermath of any kind of apocalypse, whether it's zombies or a climate apocalypse. You know, it just allows us to be a little more prepared. So the next part is weaponry, because we need to know how to protect ourselves. And how many of you guys watch The Walking Dead and just wonder how many bullets there actually are? Like, exactly. Because I watch The Walking Dead and I'm just amazed that, well, one, they're still alive, but and two, how they always seem to be starving when they're in a forest surrounded by food. And three, where are they getting all the bullets? Especially when they had Eugene in that one season trying to make one bullet. You know, it's like, come on, guys. And this is where traditional weaponry will come in handy. And usually I have a skull cracker to play with up here, but I don't think it would made it on the plane this time around, so he's at home. But usually stone skull crackers are one of the main weapons that would be really come in handy. And as you can see in the diagram, one of the stone skull cracker that I'm talking about would be the third picture, or the first one on the bottom. It would look very similar to that. The one that I have is kind of like a combination of that one and the first one, or the second one on the top. But war hatchets, bow and arrow, jawbone clubs, stone ball clubs, these will all come in handy, and they're very easy to make. The skull cracker that I made was basically made out of wood that I found on the street and a broken knife. And that's because in an apocalypse, you know, we're not always going to be able to just have access to weapons. We're not going to have access to the things that we need to make those weapons. So we're going to have to be able to use whatever we find in the environment around us. So it may be something like a rock. It may be a rock, duct tape, and a stick. You know, we're going to have to get crafty. And, you know, this is where you guys might want to make friends with your arts and crafty friends, because they're going to have this down on lock. But weaponry, because we need to know how to protect ourselves and how to do it silently, because I think, as we've all learned, zombies are, you know, summoned by sound. It arouses their attention. So we're going to have to be quiet. You know, we're not going to be screaming. We're not going to be, you know, yelling, which is actually goes back to something that's very interesting that I learned about Lakota people, was that, you know, in times of war, they were actually able to train their babies to be quiet when they needed to be. Like the babies knew when to make sounds, when not to. And it's something that a lot of people don't really realize, because so much of what we see in pop media culture when it comes to protecting our communities means that you have to expend whatever threat there is, which even if that's a kid, you know, we've seen movies where a kid's crying and somebody takes out the kid to protect the rest, and that's just not the way it has to be. There are other ways for it to go down. And I think the Lakota people have kind of like the knowledge of how we could do that easily. But the most crucial task in surviving any apocalypse is really taking care of each other and building community. And we've seen that with Walking Dead. They survive better when they're a group and when they're, you know, kind of loyal to each other. And for Native Americans, that's how we've survived colonization. That's how we've survived our own apocalypse. And it's because we did it together. You know, we made sure that nobody was left behind. We didn't think of anybody as expendable. We made sure that we protect our children. We made sure that we protected the elders. And we prioritized community care over individual care, which is something that, you know, when it comes to zombie movies and zombies in pop culture, there's always this means of like, you got to look out for number one. You got to look out for yourself. And they kind of do sometimes have these, I guess you would say, like community conflicts where, you know, everything kind of hits the fan. And that's true, you know, because no community is ever going to be 100% on the same page of how to address certain issues or which direction to go. But you're going to have to be able to negotiate, compromise, and work together to make sure that you're doing the best for each other. And so that's about how we would survive a zombie apocalypse, Rez style. And I know, like, you know, it's not as, I wish I had my zombie whacker, because that makes it really fun and interactive, getting to destroy stuff with it, not necessarily cracking zombie skulls, but, you know, cracking maybe a watermelon. But, you know, there's a lot of things that we could take away from how Natives survived colonization. Because, you know, as you can see, like, Native people were still here despite the best and maximum efforts of the U.S. to eradicate us. Like, we're still here, we're still thriving. And the important thing to realize that in living a post-apocalyptic lives, it also means that we're still trying to determine who it is that we are and who it is that we're going to be going forward from here. And so I think in the case of an apocalypse, we all need to remember that we all have humanity, and that humanity isn't a weakness but a strength. So thank you all for being here today.
Who has a question, and I'll give you a mic. Anybody? Awesome.
From that thought that you just had about fiber arts, I recently went down to Bend, Oregon, and they had some great exhibits about how they're reawakening fiber arts and bringing modern stuff into the traditional stuff. I don't remember the tribe. It was very cool going to the high plains, though, because it was a very cool exhibit and very much about fiber arts and about weaving. So,
Oh, that's really cool.
yeah.
So you already mentioned Blood Quantum, which is already on my to-watch list, but I was wondering if you had any other recommendations on native horror or just apocalypse media in general that you think does the like community aspect and does it right as opposed to maybe Walking Dead?
So there's a movie, I gave a whole list yesterday of movies. Blood Quantum for sure, I really like because it makes you question identity. But I also think that there's several other movies that do a really good job. There's one called The Smudging by Mike J. Marin. And it's an incredible film because at first you kind of think you're watching a documentary before it goes into the more horror side of things. But I think it's a really unique film that I highly recommend. There's also a movie, and it's a short called Violet. And it kind of deals with some, I guess you would say like the impact of when Native Americans were medically incarcerated for being Native. Like that was the thing they thought we had to overcome. And I think that's a really good film. There's also a really good film called In Our Hands, or In Our Own Hands by Jennifer Baranchak. And it kind of deals with the murdered and missing Indigenous women, but I really like it because it's about women taking the power back in their hands to address the issue rather than sitting back and waiting to be saved. But it's a really good film as well. And I also, if you go to a tribeCalledGeek.com, I also have 2 articles that kind of give you a lot of horror movies to watch. Some of them are shorts and some of them are full length. There's also Slashback, which I highly recommend, and I think you can watch it on Hulu right now. And it deals with Inuit girls who kind of take on aliens. And it's absolutely fantastic.
And just like a little side note, we did a horror and folklore panel that Johnnie Jae was on, and she told one of the creepiest doll stories. So if you want to go to Twitch, or actually it's on YouTube, and go to GeekGirlCon and look up the horror and it's a top A story.
Yeah,
100%.
and if you're looking for books, My Heart is a Chainsaw. I don't know if anybody's read that yet, but it's absolutely fantastic. There's a new horror anthology that just came out called Never Whistle at Night. And the stories in that anthology are so good. Like every single one has you just like not wanting to go to sleep and wanting to kind of smudge yourself before going to bed. But it's so great. And a lot of Native horror writers who are up and coming, some who are more established, but it's an incredible read. Yeah, if you get I would highly suggest the Audible. Because, oh my gosh, and I don't know if you guys know, you guys have pretty much seen Reservation Dogs. You've seen the episode with Deer Woman. Conatia Horn, who is Deer Woman, is actually one of the narrators for the Audible version of Never Whistle at Night, so highly recommend it.
I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Yarrow. I hear I'm the bane of your existence. I actually just wanted to thank you for emphasizing the importance of community. I grew up rural and now I'm in the city, and I actually during the pandemic thought about like I'm a nurse, and so I definitely have things that I can do for my community, but I started learning my neighbors' names and what they could do and stuff like that, and I realized that that's something that's not emphasized a whole lot in survival
really
scenarios. So that's all.
Yeah, thank you. And it's really not. When we're looking at horror films, when we're looking at especially zombies, they tend to not really center community as much as they should, or they make it seem like it's more of a weakness. And I think a lot of that is because as people in general, we don't like responsibility these days, especially big responsibilities, So I think it's really hard for people to realize that, in dealing with survival, that it's not just about you. It's about the community still, and that you have to really weigh the pros and cons of what's best for you and what's best for the community, and realizing that without community, you're not going to be able to survive on your own.
Thank you for your talk.
In that vein, in that vein, there's an app that's supposed to help you run. I walk, but and it's Run Zombies. Zombies Run. Yeah, that. And it's really good. It's really fun. It's the only app that's ever gotten me to exercise. And it's not horror, but it's community-based. And it's also running-based because we can't afford to waste gasoline. So it's all running-based. You go out searching for supplies. You go out running errands, dropping off things, because it's all runner-based. But it is community-based because sometimes you just want your zombie to not be all about number one, your zombie fiction to be community-based.
Yeah, and I know, I talk about community, but sometimes you also need somebody to push down just in case, just in case. Just make sure it's not someone you like that much.
Always bring a spare.
Exactly. I'll tell you the most disappointing thing I think in Walking Dead to me is just how they're always starving and how they're always looking for food. But when you look around them, they're in forest areas and in places where, as natives, that there's wild onions, that that there's roots and different foods that they can eat. And I'm just like, how are you guys not seeing this? But it's because we've become so conditioned to having everything come to us so easily in the grocery store that we don't recognize the food sources around us. But man, there's nothing that irks me more than just watching zombie horror movies and seeing them starving when they're literally just surrounded by food sources. And even fishing, none of them go fishing, what?
If you take the time to go hunt or go fish, how do you do that and not get jumped by a zombie?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
Is this just like the risk, you get jumped by a bear, you get jumped by a zombie? Oh, well,
Yeah, and also knowing which species a zombie virus is going to go to. Because I don't know if you've seen Blood Quantum, and I talked about this a little bit yesterday in my panel, but the opening scene of that was pretty traumatizing for me as somebody who doesn't like fish already. But now I can't even look at salmon without thinking of Blood Quantum. But there's a pretty interesting scene in Blood Quantum where, one of the dads, he's just gone done fishing and he's cleaning his fish and, it comes to life on him. And he's like, what in the world? And he's already skinned it, he's gutted it, and it's over there flopping around. And it's totally creepy, but it brings up the question too of, how do you know what food sources are going to be contaminated or are going to be susceptible to those virus zombies and which aren't? So that's going to be another question, when it comes to hunting and fishing that you kind of have to consider, which, they kind of did in The Walking Dead. They set it up to where it looked like the food, like the animals were going to be infected as well, but then nothing ever came of that. So that was also disappointing because I really wanted to see how they would tackle that. Because I don't know if anybody reads Brian Keene, but he has a novel called Dead Sea, which gave me nightmares because there were zombie tuna. And there were zombie whales, zombie sharks.
Sharks, no.
Yeah. And, the idea of being turned into a zombie because a tuna bit you, that's terrifying.
I wouldn't admit that to the other zombies.
Or getting bit by Nemo? What if you got bit by Nemo and turned into a zombie? That'd be terrifying. But that book is terrifying. Because that also dealt, because they had the fish that were infected and they thought the birds were safe. And then all of a sudden the birds got infected, which, when birds get infected, it's pretty much game over because birds can go anywhere. There's nowhere we could go from safety from birds. Oh, which one?
Parable of the Sower. It's a post-apocalyptic. It's not zombies, however, it is climate apocalypse, and it takes place in 2023. in 2024, and it is very much about community and how to build community, and the superpower in it is actually empathy, like hyper empathy, in fact. So it's a very interesting book and all about community, since we were talking about
Yeah, I'll
that.
have to check that out.
Okay, so I got to know, because I'm going to ask it. What do you think about shelter?
Oh, shelter is going to be a hard one because, for us, like urban people, our main priority is going to have to be trying to get out of our cities or finding places in a city that can be fortified. But, even then, like just the sheer number of people, especially, for example, LA, where, one block could have over 50,000 people, there's just going to be, you're going to be contending with masses. So finding shelter for urban people is going to be a lot harder than it is for people who are more rural. But also, it's also kind of knowing where to go. There are communities outside of California near, I believe it's Palm Springs, but they actually have a zombie survival city already kind of built out there, where they're already building a community that could survive an apocalypse. And they're specifically a zombie apocalypse, but it's right outside of Palm Springs, I think. And, they're already thinking about like, okay, how are we going to deal with shelter? How are we going to deal with the urban people coming out into the more rural areas? So they're kind of fortifying those areas already. For a lot of Native communities, shelter is already a problem, even for people that do have homes. It's just not up to code a lot of the times, especially on a lot of reservations that don't have a lot of economic means. You see a lot of the houses are kind of put together with just scraps, like of whatever metal they can find or whatever wood, even cardboard. And that's something that I think is going to be a huge adjustment because we're not going to have ready shelter or be able to really put down any kind of steady roots until we figure out what exactly it is we're up against and how it's going to move, I guess you would say. So shelter is going to be hard. But I think for a lot of tribes that have access to the traditional strongholds, I think that's where you're going to see a lot of communities set up, which is why I mention a couple, but I don't mention some of the ones that are still used today, because, then you get people a little too interested, which is something that when I started doing this presentation, I did have an offer to turn it into a book, and I turned it down because a lot of the knowledge, I'm fine sharing it with smaller audiences and stuff, but I think having it in a book form, you never know the intentions of the people reading that book. And, I know a lot of people are survivalists. And, as we've seen with colonization, it's all about take, and no reciprocity. So I kind of decided it would be a little irresponsible to share and go more in depth with some of the information, because it would be giving away some of the traditional strongholds, which then we wouldn't only have to be contending with zombies for that space, but also with non-natives or non-community people, trying to overtake those spaces from us. So, but I do think you'd see more natives in those traditional spaces. And, just all of a sudden you'd kind of see an absence of native people, and we'd be in our traditional strongholds, bye-bye.
Well, thank you, Johnny.
All right, thank you.